Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Fifth Estate. I'm Sally Warhaft, and it's particularly great to see so many of you on a pretty cold winter Melbourne night, but not surprising given our guests this evening. We're here tonight to talk about how political parties make decisions about where to put money, our money. And I think our two guests tonight are overly qualified to share their thoughts on this, but also they cover the spectrum of leadership, being in opposition, federal and state politics. Kristina Keneally is, of course, the former Labor Premier of New South Wales, and she's the member for Hewson. She served as the 42nd Premier and the first woman in the state to be Premier from 2009 to 2011. She has a BA in Political Science with honours and a Master's in Religious Studies from the University of Dayton. Kristina is the chair and patron of numerous organisations, but I think of particular interest is Basketball Australia and patron for the Stillbirth Association. Dr. John Hewson is, of course, an economist, an academic, a business consultant, but most importantly for us, the former leader of the Liberal Party and the Coalition for 4 years, and the member for Wentworth for 8 years. He now runs an investment banking business and is the director of too many companies to mention. Please welcome warmly our guests tonight. This idea occurred to me because, of course, we're coming up to an election and we're going to hear a lot in the coming weeks about where our money should go. And we will know where it will be going when we elect the next government. But I wonder how the decisions are made, how groups of politicians and the people around them actually form these decisions, and how you make choices between all the competing areas of interest. So is it health? Is it education? Should we not be really spending money on any of these things or as much? Should we invest in one big thing properly or try and spread it around as much as we can? I suppose to start, I'd like to ask you both what your kind of philosophy is on spending. And Kristina, I'll start with you.
Thank you, and thanks, John. It's great to be here with you, and thank you all of you for turning out. As you were speaking there, I thought there's theory and there's praxis as to how parties and governments make decisions. And of course, in theory, they formulate policy platforms, and in theory, they make policy commitments based on what reflects their platform. I say in theory because often, particularly when you are in government, you have to make decisions that may be in contradiction to your party's platform. But the party platform is an important piece of a document. It's an important piece of work, and certainly as someone who signs up to a political party, you do so based on what they believe and what they uphold and what they say they make decisions that they use as a basis for decision making. So, for example, for myself and for the party I am a member of and was elected representative for, we have a commitment to working people. We have a commitment to providing services and equity of access to all. And for me personally, a view that the role of government is to help those who otherwise cannot help themselves. So certainly in government, I had a strong view and a commitment to the disabled, to the poor, to people who had trouble otherwise accessing services and opportunity. Now, those are very broad, and some of you might even say motherhood statements. But for me, those values were reflected in the party that I'm a member of, which is why I signed up and was willing to stand up for them at election time.
All right, I want to hear from John, and then I'll come back to you about how do you choose between the disabled and the poor.
Well, I got involved in politics, excuse me, working for Philip Lynch in the middle 70s. I came out of the Reserve Bank, and I was, having worked in the IMF, I was all enthusiastic about how good policy should in fact be good politics with a relatively short lag.
Have you lost some of that enthusiasm, John?
Yeah, well, 93 taught me that you can have good policy and it won't necessarily turn out to be good politics. In fact, most people would say my fight back package of 93 was the longest political suicide note in history. And so, but I haven't given up on the belief that we've got to get back to a world where politics is driven by policy and not by short-term point scoring to win the media on a day-to-day basis. But when I look at where we've come today, we have some very, very big issues today and some very big ideas. And national disability is one, or Gonski, or infrastructure, the three big areas that people talk about. What worries me is that they're not funded. The ideas are there and they're being developed and refined, but they're not funded, and there's nothing in our federation as it's structured to actually see that they will be funded when they're fully operational. I'm worried that the federation is grinding to a halt in terms of its financial viability. The states don't have the tax base they're going to need to pay for their share. The Commonwealth is actually restricted in revenues for turning out to be a lot less than they expected, and so on. So various factors are coming together to give you a bit of a crunch. And that's going to make it very difficult for some of the big ideas that are out there now to be implemented, let alone some of the other things that we think should be done. So I come back to the basics. I mean, I think the community's got to have a pretty mature debate at some point, and this is hard in the political system we've got. But I think you need a pretty mature debate about what you really, well, realistically should expect of government, what services you should think government should provide, and then have the debate about how they're going to be paid for. And a lot of the points that were just made by Kristina about fairness and equity and so on, and helping those who can't help themselves. I mean, both sides would basically sign off on that. They just have very different ways of going about getting there. And unfortunately in these days, I think a lot of the motivation that should be there to be driven by good policy is not. It's sacrificed for short-term political gain.
So how do you do it then? How do you even make the first decision, getting back to your, I think the decision, say, between disabled people, poor people, is probably as good as any other as to where you might put the money to back a policy. So you've got two ministers or shadow ministers putting their ideas forward. How then does one of them get grabbed? How does it happen?
Well, first of all, I don't necessarily, accept the premise that it has to be one or the other.
But not everybody's great ideas are going to get a run, are they?
Not everyone's great ideas, and I think that's the other premise. Not everyone has a great idea. And some of the things John's just alluded to, I think, are spot on in terms of policy formulation. I think that has to be the first question. What is the right policy? My 15-year-old last night said to me, so this Gonski thing, that's just putting a lot of money into schools. I said, yep. He said, to do what? I said, yep, I can't answer that, darling. And I thought, well, if a 15-year-old gets that, if a 15-year-old is asking and we can't necessarily explain what it's actually going to do except just put a lot of money into schools, I think that's a challenge for my side of politics to be able to have a better articulation. So what is the policy? What are we actually trying to achieve? What is the problem we're trying to solve? And is more money the only answer to it? And I think that those sorts of questions in the policy formulation process in Australia that's a poverty of our processes at the moment. We either try to come up with a very fast solution, or we try to throw money at a problem, or we try to borrow wholesale a policy from overseas, say from the UK. That's a real, in my view, weakness of the Australian political system. We say it worked in the UK, so it might work here. There's a whole range of things that don't necessarily happen before a policy gets before a cabinet or a government. But let's go back to the NDIS. Let's take disability. And I'm going to proudly say the genesis for all of this started in New South Wales, where we had the Motor Accident Authority program that was a disability scheme. When I was Minister for Disability, we started with Bill Shorten to push the idea of a national disability insurance scheme. We wanted to expand ours in New South Wales. We had a view that it would work better if it was a national process, and I give a lot of credit to Shorten, who did a lot of that detailed policy work to bring forward the idea of using an insurance scheme rather than consolidated revenue to fund what is a very complex area, but yet an area where we needed funding for government services. Where I think that policy development, and John is right here, has not been carried forward as the best way possible, is that we haven't again yet fully articulated what the NDIS will do, and we haven't fully articulated how we're going to pay for it. And the risk there is you set up expectations that you cannot deliver upon in the electorate, and that just generates cynicism, and that just becomes a never-ending cycle. If you have poor policy, if you don't have the problem defined and you don't have the funding defined, the next thing you get is cynicism, and political cycle becomes one that's very difficult. Unfortunately, I think in many ways that's the circumstance we're in today in Australia.
Yeah, look, I agree. On Gonski's fixing a problem of the past, in the sense that the funding model for schools in this country was breaking down. It was breaking down not just in terms of the aggregate amount of money that is being put into schools, but in the distribution of that money to, in particular, to disadvantaged schools and those with disabilities.
That's exactly right.
And so what it does is it fixes that model. It puts a bit more cash in the tin to buy support, but at the same time it does the redistribution, so that there's a more equitable funding of public versus private schools, more equitable funding of those in disadvantaged socio-economic circumstances or disadvantaged personal circumstances.
But it doesn't answer
what
questions about
What worries me, though,
teachers,
is the expectations that are being built is Gonski's going to fix everything.
Right.
At the same time, I go and look at the Asian Century paper, for example, where we want to see our schools rank at the top end of the spectrum rather than in the middle of the school spectrum right now. And I ask myself, what does Gonski do about any of that? What does Gonski do in a future sense to look at the structure of education as it will change with technology, teacher training, physical buildings? All that's going to change dramatically. And you end up with, well, there's no answer in Gonski for that. Yet the expectations that are being built up, as Kristina says, are much more than just fixing a past funding model. And a good example of how that can be politically real easy to do is dare I mention his name, Kevin Rudd's proposal to give a laptop to every high school student.
Just remember you brought him up first.
Yeah, okay. I mentioned in passing. But the policy idea was, okay, futuristic, and yes, that sort of makes sense, assuming you don't worry too much about locking yourself into a particular type of technology. But the practical reality was that there wasn't a school in the country that had the power capacity to run laptops for all the high school students. It wasn't a school in the country that had the teachers trained to supervise classes full of high school kids with laptops. And 3, the number was much bigger than he said it would be. So the idea is out there, and it gets a lot of
not a
part of an
force,
education revolution.
Not a police force big enough to patrol the kids walking home from school.
Undeliverable, and it kept getting cut back and cut back. And now I'm worried about National Disability Scheme because, look, disability in politics has been a very difficult area to deal with. I remember, I think back in the early 90s, I was the first federal leader to speak at the national conference, and this is where you got into trouble. People with disabilities or disabled people. You get half the room out there, offside of you, so people just stayed away. Yet it was a mounting problem. Today we've got something like 850,000 disability pensions out there. I mean, huge numbers. And the whole thing is getting out of control, and yet there's no equitable distribution of services and access and carers and equipment and so on. So the scheme itself is great, but it's going to cost a bomb. We don't know yet because we don't have a definition of disability. There are going to be pilot schemes to do that and so on, and we don't know what services people realistically want. I mean, without being too unkind, you go to somebody who's got a child with cerebral palsy and say, what would you like by way of service? I want my child to walk. Now, realistically, it may be that that child will never walk. But, to satisfy that demand over a period of years is going to be a very, very difficult thing to do. And if you multiply that by the magnitude of the problem of those with disabilities in our society, it's a huge, huge problem. Now, the numbers are, the government says, oh, we've funded. They're raising $11.5 billion in this budget over 4 years from the levy. They're only spending under $2 billion on the project in those 4 years. And the full-year cost of that program on their numbers today without a definition of disability is somewhere between $20 and $30 billion by 2022. Now, you think $20 to $30 billion, where's it going to come from? And what I fear is whoever's in government, they're going to have to sit back and say, oh, we've got to trim this definition of disability, we'll shift this, we'll favour this group, we won't do that,
We'll make
and that is going to be a political
yep.
minefield beyond belief, and all the time it's going to be because there's no money. Go back to my point about the Federation not being fully funded. Easy to say this will be done, easy to say it'll be done as a joint funding exercise between the Commonwealth and the states. Commonwealth doesn't have the money, the states aren't going to have the money, how's it going to be done? And that's the problems that I think are being built by raising expectations. And we've just picked two areas, Gonski and disability. You say the same about infrastructure. We've got hundreds of billions of dollars of infrastructure requirements around the country, and this budget, federal budget, spends $3 billion over 4 years.
So then, just to go back to my original question then, how does it get up? How does it get to the stage where, with everything you have both just said, we're getting an NDIS? Everybody's actually agreed on it. I mean, it's a miracle.
Bipartisan.
It's bipartisan. States, everyone's on board. The community. You couldn't have a more perfect political situation in a more imperfect political culture right now. And yet, how, with all these problems that you both identify, how did it come to be?
Look, I think NDIS is an extreme example and probably not the best one for the purposes of how do policies get endorsed and funded, because in the current environment, there is not a politician in the country who is going to say, I don't think we should have an NDIS. That is just the blunt. And so, if you want to say, is there a political reality here? Yes. Blind Freddie, frankly, could have seen that there was no chance that Tony, that's probably a bad analogy. I apologise. I do apologise. But you don't have to, let me put it this way. You do not have to be a political strategist to have worked out that Tony Abbott was going to support an NDIS levy. Because there's not a politician in the country that was going to say no to that. So I think that the more appropriate question might be one around hospitals or education or infrastructure. How do those proposals get their way through a process whereby they get endorsed? The politics and the politics of the moment are important as well. And so disability is another great example of the politics of the moment. 5 years ago, it wouldn't have gotten up. But there has been a campaign and a grassroots movement and a discussion and a productivity commission report and a growing realization with an aging population and more visibility in the media that this is a big problem for our country. And this is an unmet area of need with very deserving people who need our support, who can't otherwise access it.
It's hard to...
I was just going to say, in some cases you make the choice because you get a political mandate to do it. And a good example was rather than responding to climate change. I'm going to sign Kyoto and Howard wouldn't. I'm going to move on and put down an emissions trading scheme which will deliver us a market-based price on carbon. He had a very definitive mandate, and he had a very tight schedule on how to do that. He had the Garneau report, a white paper, a green paper, the legislation, and he used to say publicly, if I can't get it through the Parliament first time out, you can't negotiate it through, then I'm going to have a double dissolution, I'm going to drive it through. Now, if he'd stayed with that mandate back in February of 2010 and had the double dissolution, I think he actually would have won that. I think he'd actually still be Prime Minister. But he backed off at the last hurdle, yet he had the mandate. And when I look at some of the circumstances where you're trying to make major change and you don't have a mandate, it's very difficult to create that mandate before you can get started. And Bob Hawke used to say to me, your basic failing in '93 was you should have put the GST in the drawer and pulled it out after the election and said, surprise, surprise. And Bob and I did a couple of two-man shows on this thing, and that's his view. And I said, no, I actually felt that you needed a mandate. You need a mandate to do some of these big changes. and you've got to go and get the mandate. Now, there will be a mandate for the National Disability Scheme.
Absolutely.
And there'll be a mandate for some form of change in school funding, but that's going to be a very vague mandate. As the years go by and the political realities cut in on that.
It's a culture now of entitlement, but also expectation. People have incredible expectations, I think, from state, federal, both governments.
If you give people a benefit in 1 year, becomes a right the next year and very difficult to target or trim back the third year. And that's what happens, you know, it's the way our system works.
I mean, also, though, I think that governments will kind of look after everything, and in some ways the Australian nation state was formed in that it was a big country. It needed a massive state input from its formation in order to exist. It's always been there in Australian history, and I wonder now whether governments just simply try doing too much and doing one thing per term really, really well would be a better bet than trying to solve everyone's problems.
You're at one level, I agree completely. You know, Bob Carr, I remember when he was Premier, I was a humble backbencher, and he had a speech to caucus where he talked about the great challenges we faced were climate change, the ageing of the population, and the growing expectation of the electorate. And you add to that, you know, which became a big issue, and it continues to be, the lack of state government access to the revenue that can help you solve some of those problems. The fact, the way our federation is structured, that the GST and the distribution and the whole way our federal state system works, works, that it is really hard for cash-strapped state governments to meet those demands. But growing expectations are a massive challenge. One of my favourite letters, I clipped it out of the newspaper and hung it up on my pin board when I was in office. You know, somebody had written in and said, "My houseplant died. I blame the local MP." Yeah, and I was the local MP for the person who wrote this. But I think the humorous example of that letter writer was to make this point that we have such extraordinary expectations from government. And I don't know how you have the honest conversation that I think we do need to have. You know, I was a minister for ageing. You're never the ageing minister. You're the minister for ageing. And as minister for, you know, if I look ahead to the future of what an ageing population means for disability, for healthcare, for transport, you know, even for things like, you know, driver registration. I mean,
for our whole economy,
for everything. And yet, at the same time, we have these expectations that government's going to be able to continue to fund, to deliver services for that ageing population that right now are a challenge for government to meet. It's going to be a very brave government that makes a decision, for example, in New South Wales, to restrict pensioner excursion tickets to senior citizens, but at some point it's going to have to be done to enable our public transport system to run efficiently. So that's an example of a clear, rational decision a government should make, but politically will be very loath to make.
Let alone just increasing the pension age to, say, 70. I mean,
We tried, when I was Minister for Ageing, to change the rules about how often older drivers had to be tested. Literally, I have never had that many protest meetings as a minister. I mean, I was Minister for Planning, so I had a lot of protests, but honestly, one of the biggest challenges we faced, just from a sheer anger and frustration and crowds that would show up as big as this room, was when we tried to change the regime for how often an older driver had to be tested.
It's such a pity that, you know, we can't have a sort of moratorium, say, for a week, and you get your leaders together and you lock them in a room and then feed them well, and then ask them to come back and tell us, what do you agree on? You know, what can we take
that's
out?
That's what COAG is supposed to be.
COAG worked very well in the Hawke days. When he introduced it, it worked very well. It's become a very political game again now.
Well, what
it has
changed?
Become a very political
it was the
game.
switch
it's just become
government.
politicised. I mean, it's The idea was to lift it out of that day-to-day politics. So I think we're fast coming to the view, at least I am. So go back to my point about good policy being good politics. I just don't trust politicians to handle policy anymore in a couple of key areas. And I think you've got to start to think of ways in which this can be done outside of politics. I mean, I'll give you a specific example. When I used to sit in the Fraser government cabinet meetings, day in, day out, the Monetary Policy Committee of Cabinet determined all of economic policy, basically. 7 people, 5 of them were farmers. So they were never going to think it was a good idea to put interest rates up. They were going to think it was a good idea to put the exchange rate up. And so you could go on. And you know, you had to change that process because they were making political decisions. You know, we look at the exchange rate move around today and how much it moves. They used to sit in cabinet and decide how much they should devalue it. And I remember a classic in 1976 devaluation. The recommendation was begrudgingly by Treasury for a 7.5% devaluation. And Fraser said, well, that stopped the capital that's flooding out of the country. And they said they weren't sure. He said, what about 10%? Not sure. What about 12.5%? Still not sure. What about 17.5%? Oh, shit, that'll stop it. And it stopped it, all right. That's what he did. He's 17.5%. And when you look at that sort of decision-making process, they've got nothing to do with market reality. You've got to think of a way that exchange rates and interest rates have got to be managed outside of government. That's why we have an independent Reserve Bank today, and they've got some problems with that independence. But having said that, it's a lot better than a group of people sitting in cabinet saying, I think it should go up, or I think it should go down, or good luck. You know?
Look, I think at a regulatory level, that works exceptionally well. So the Reserve, in New South Wales, we have IPART. They set all kinds of rates and fares, and I think that does work exceptionally well. Where the political reality meets the independent decision maker, I think a great example is Infrastructure Australia and Infrastructure New South Wales, which in theory are meant to be the same type of experts and rational, evidence-based decision-making about where money should be invested to address some of the infrastructure backlog, what's going to be best to generate jobs and economic investment, what's the best way to make that investment. Do you need to have tolls, user pays, public-private partnerships, et cetera, et cetera. But where the political reality hits that is governments are elected to promising to build certain pieces of infrastructure which may or may not be the most rational or the most the best investment of the taxpayer dollar, or governments meet a political reality whilst they're in office that they feel they need to address, and so therefore you get stacks of reports from Infrastructure Australia or Infrastructure New South Wales that just sit there ignored by a cabinet process because quite simply the political reality is government would rather spend money in a different way. And that's the thing. The government makes the decision on how to spend the money. So all these infrastructure bodies are a great idea in theory, but when the decision has to be made by a group of elected people sitting at a cabinet table, they're going to make a decision that they often will think is in their best electoral interest. And unfortunately, sometimes, particularly if you're not good at selling your good policy isn't good politics.
I'd go one step further. I think you've got to take some of that decision-making away from government as well. These issues are so big and so important that if they're left to the short-term political game as to whether we're going to have a rail link here or a road expansion there, in our political system today, you don't get them. I would embark on heresy at this point. I'd say that we should have something called an infrastructure bond, which, foreigners want to give us money. They want to invest in Australia, want to buy our assets. Well, let's create one which they can all have, all the central banks can buy, and let's use that money in a very clearly transparent way outside of the day-to-day cabinet process to fund some of the priorities in infrastructure. You can debate the priorities, and you can have a very transparent debate about those priorities. But in the end, don't leave it to the government to make a decision as to which one, because you get these silly games that are being played. I mean, in this budget, we just had an announcement that the federal government was going to underwrite part of the cost of the Melbourne Metro on one condition, that the state government here finds $3 billion to fund its share, which it doesn't have, is unlikely to have. Or in New South Wales, we'll do a link between two roads on the condition that they can't, that it's not a toll link, not a toll-rated link, but the economics of it are that it's the only way it's ever going to get built. So these sort of political games that get played around very fundamentally important projects, and we just lose time. We lose decades in making decisions to build infrastructure, and at the point where Sydney today is just completely gridlocked.
Well, and Sydney Airport. That's the other classic example. What a football that is between the state and federal governments, all based on a couple of marginal seats in Western Sydney.
You can stay here, both of you. Only a little bit of gridlock here.
But you just look at Sydney Airport.
It took me half an hour to come from South Melbourne. I don't think it was that.
But Sydney Airport, we've got a third runway. But the political expediency was such that Keating shortened it by 20% to get it finished on time, which meant that most of the major planes that should be using that runway can't.
That's right.
So we have a constraint that's it's an outcome of a political decision that shouldn't be there. If the runway had been its full capacity, we wouldn't have the same load problems we've got today, and you could extend the life of the airport by about 20 years.
Well, that becomes the issue of doing things really properly and into the future, which is so against our culture. I'd like to know about how these decisions are reached when you're in opposition, because different tricks and means and ways, I suppose, are employed in order to try and win office and have you go. How do you think it's different?
Well, I can only talk of my own experience there from 1990. I took over after the Howard Peacock years, and I said we had three things we had to do. We had to build party unity, because that disunity had been death, as Hawke had pointed out. Secondly, we had to build policy credibility. We had none. In 1987, Howard's tax package didn't add up, and in 1990, Peacock couldn't remember the health policy. I nearly couldn't remember Peacock, and so I said that's the second objective, and the third one was to restructure the party as an effective campaigning force. Now, I had a mandate in terms of the party to do that. The only way I could see I could do it is involve everybody in that process. Had people out there assessing what was required in a policy sense across the board, had people on various policy committees with specific tasks, whether it was developing a policy detail or developing a marketing strategy or whatever. So everybody had a job, everyone had a business card, everyone was busy. They didn't have time to white ant me and work against me. And so I got basically 2.5 years to actually get this up and running and started going. It's very difficult to do that today. Today, the political debate is such that you don't have any detail on policies. They all blame me for that, because that suicide notice sits out there as a stark reminder of what can go wrong. But the other extreme is now the case. We have basically policies adopt points. I'll stop the boats, I'll pay back the debt, I'll eliminate I'll create a budget surplus, I'll fund a disability scheme, I'll have Gonski. They're points. How? We've been talking about it tonight. How? When? Those sort of questions don't get answered, and the debate is now really down to slogans rather than policies. And that is a really bad situation where we've ended up where, how do you break out of that? Somebody's got to stand up and say, I'm not playing that game. I guess that's where I'd come back to, if you were coming in as an incoming Prime Minister today, as we were talking about Barry O'Farrell before, what would you do? I think the smart thing is to say, look, there are about 2 or 3 things I really want to do in the first term, and these are what they are, and I'm going to do them. And I'm just going to get on and do those. Govern around it, but that's what I'm going to do. Whereas the other extreme was Obama, who promised everybody he ever spoke to all the way through the primary campaign and the presidential election campaign, he had an answer for everybody, every constituency, every part of the country. Except when he got there, Christ, I can't deliver any of this. I had to start cutting back on those sort of commitments, even the big ones. Guantanamo Bay, Afghanistan, they were hard ones for him to cut back on. Healthcare, he was going to deliver something, but in the end, people look back and say, well, what did he actually achieve in that first term? And that's the problem. If you let expectations get raised out there that you're going to do a lot, and quite often the election campaign is designed, is focused on let's get rid of the other crowd, the other one's got to be better. There's this expectation out there today that on September the 15th, the world will be different in Australia because Abbott will win and we'll have a whole change. Well, that may or may not be the case, but the expectation is there, and to the extent that it's not there, it's going to be a problem. Like a lot of people expected Barry O'Farrell to do a lot more in New South Wales with the mandate he had. And people are saying, well, what's he actually done? How much? He must be working a lot behind the scenes, you lose those mandates very, very quickly. And so I think that the way to answer your question is to say, I think the sensible thing is to just pick 2 or 3 things that you really can achieve in the first 3-year term or something, and just go on and do that. Rudd had that mandate, as I was saying.
Yes.
He had climate change, he had education, had 2 or 3 areas where he had a clear mandate, different, and he didn't deliver on them because, you know, it paid his price in the end.
I found out recently something curious, I thought, and that is that there's only 2 ministers in the government, federal government at the moment, who have public service people as their chiefs of staff. I think it was Greg Combay. Greg Combay and Stephen Smith, from memory. Now, I found that interesting because I know in the past there was much more influence of people that have actually had real experience in the departments, know how these things work now. People are bringing in their people.
You know, that's an interesting point, because I would take the counter argument, and I can't speak for the Liberal Party, but I think one of the weaknesses of the Labor Party over the past, certainly the decade I served, and possibly over really since the hot Keating years, is that we have increasingly relied on the public service to provide us with policy, rather than invest in the type of think tanks, research, policy analysts, the sorts of things that are done better in other countries and I think are done better by our opponents. We don't invest in our own policy formulation, and we've allowed the public service to take on that role, particularly when we've spent protracted periods in government in the states around Australia, and I think that is a weakness for us. I think it's a weakness for us now that we're in opposition in a number of states, and I think it will be a weakness for us, you know, if we go into opposition in September. And so I think that's that reliance on the public service can go too far. On the other hand, ministerial staff have increasingly expanded and become very political. On the other, but you really can't fault. At one level, I won't fault ministers or the Westminster system for that happening, because the reality is the expectation, the demand, the scrutiny, and the politicization of ministers' roles has also grown in the 10 years that I served, and I'm sure it will continue to. It's a significant challenge. How do you, as a minister, we used to have, for example, when I was Premier, I used to call it the 4 o'clock ring around. Every afternoon, you would get 2 or 3 print journalists who had clearly waited to the last possible moment to be credible, 4:30, and had thrown some really nasty question that you had to then spend your staff spent the next 2 hours running around in ministers' offices and departments trying to find an answer, trying to work out the agenda. Often there wouldn't be a story even the next day. It was a wasted 2 hours of our time. But it was yet things we had to do as ministers and executive government to answer media queries. Now, I'm not saying the media don't have a right to ask questions, but there was a lot of wasted time and staff that needed to do that, sort of servicing the media. So this isn't just governments want to grow their staff and grow their influence. There's actually a demand for that coming from the media and expectation from the public.
John,
I think it's a very complex issue to make definitive statements about. I think in general I would have to say that I think that the political staff has become far more politicised than they should be. But you can argue both sides. I remember a large part of the collapse of the Whitlam government, for example, was that a Treasury officer had been appointed to Jim Cairns' staff, and he was copying documents that Cairns was working on and sending them back to the Treasury, who were then leaking them to the media, and of course you had the debacle, which was Keneally and so on. Now, I'm not defending what they were trying to do, but their incapacity to actually work on their own to deliver something was severely constrained, and that the reaction to that sort of experience has seen these staffs politicised much more than otherwise would be the case. I mean, Rudd got into a lot of trouble because he had relatively junior, inexperienced staff, and he was requiring all his senior ministers, people who'd been around for years, to clear their diary, to clear their speeches and so on with these juniors. And those ministers are actually complaining to people like me, saying, how on earth can you operate as a minister when I've got this sort of very much a political sort of structure? And you see a lot of very bad political judgments coming out of some of those staff. I mean, Julia got into trouble a while back when they were at a function, I think it was a bipartisan function in Indigenous affairs at the lobby, and one of her staff agitated the tent embassy to come down and start banging on the windows. You saw one example today, I don't know whether you saw it in Victoria, the photograph of Julia Gillard sitting and doing a bit of knitting or something. An idea of a communications director who happens to be on a 457 visa. These are complex issues and not necessarily going to add any significant value to the substance of the debate. They're noise, they take a front page of a newspaper, they've taken a hell of a lot of TV and column space today. And that's, I think, going too far in the political dimension, the spin dimension, rather than being prepared to answer some of the questions that are required. And, I guess the difficulty today is, when you get the 4 o'clock ring around, you don't answer. You just start a process where we're not playing your game, you're not setting our agenda, we set the agenda, I'll call a press conference. People are available every day for doorstops and press conferences where, go back to the Menzies era or the Whitlam era or even or the Fraser era, they'd have a press conference once every 4 weeks, 6 weeks, and you could take all questions. But they weren't on a daily call to have some inane line that's going to, dominate the television news that evening. And I think the whole process is, as I say, it's complex because it's all gone that way. There's a lot of reasons for it. And one final comment. I do think the public sector in general are very high quality, but they do have agendas. If you look at the Yes Minister program, it makes the point that Sir Humphrey can be a problem if you're trying to be an objective government showing a bit of initiative. And we did have a period where in Canberra that used to be referred to as 7 key departmental heads were called the 7 dwarfs, which today you wouldn't get away with, but they were all actually short. And they were called short dwarfs, and they held all the power. And governments couldn't do much because those guys went to the Commonwealth Club every day for lunch and dinner, and they thought they called all the shots. That process has, I think, effectively been broken down, thank heaven. But on the other side, the pendulum's gone too far, and it's become far too political, far too focused on spin and scoring short-term points rather than the balance that should be in the middle. So you've got to have a blend of both.
So what's it going to take before this reaches, sort of crashes, I suppose, and it just can't go on, where the public will no longer accept it, where politicians and journalists are presumably just so exhausted by the whole thing? What might happen and to change it? Is it just going to require we always look to it, don't we, a magical person to come along and say,
leadership can change it.
I'm not going to play this game. I can't imagine I sometimes try to say Paul Keating in this era, or certainly Robert Menzies. He blocked the introduction of television in Australia because he didn't like what it might do to our culture. I just can't imagine leaders like that playing ball with this culture. But
well, Keating said something to me after the '93 election. He took me aside the first day we went back to Parliament.
Tell us everything he said.
And he said to me...
It's probably not able to be repeated.
No, it was quite interesting because he said he wanted to apologise for some of the things he'd said about me and the names he'd called me, because he was quite happy he could have accepted the fact that he'd lost to me, and he thought he had. But his reason for wanting to apologise, he said, you've got to understand one thing. That is, I would say and do anything to win. Now, that struck me as quite a big surprise, because I'm in there thinking that good policy is good politics in a short lag, and he's telling me to do anything, which he did. He's a guy who fought for GST and then used it to bang me on the head. But as true as that was then, that has become the name of the game in politics today. You will say or do anything to score a point, to win the day and go on to the next day, to another issue, to another circumstance, and you don't get continuity, you don't get any capacity to generate policy, build the public education. I couldn't believe, for example, when Gillard changed her mind about a carbon price and said she's got to put a price on carbon back in February, and then didn't say anything about it either educate people, link it to the science, anything, until July, which meant that Abbott in this environment had a free kick every day to make all sorts of outrageous claims about the sky will fall in and women will become barren or whatever. He could get away with it because there was no concerted communication attempt by the governments to say why we've changed our mind, why we think it's important, why we think putting a price on carbon really does make a difference to what's going to happen. None of that was done. And in fact, you had, the debate actually collapsed to fairly a degenerative stage where scientists were being pilloried for daring to express a view. And it was a bizarre outcome of a really badly managed set of circumstances.
Yeah, look, I can't argue with you on some of that. I would observe that in government, you really have two opportunities to be creative, innovative, daring, and to spend some time talking to the electorate honestly. One is when you're either about to win with a thumping majority, or you have just won with a thumping majority, or one is where you're going to lose. And everyone knows it. And, I was in the latter circumstance, of course, and we did do some things in that time that otherwise would have been very hard for us to do. We legalized same-sex adoption, and we spent a lot of time, I certainly spent a lot of time explaining why we were doing that and putting forward the case as to why we would do it. We did something that was counter to Treasury advice, and we lowered public transport fares for the people who lived farthest away, and we raised them for the people who lived closest to the city. Now, Treasury said you shouldn't do that, and that's uneconomical, and we said, you know what, the people who live farthest away from the city are also on the lowest socioeconomic, they have the least capacity to pay, and they most need the access to transport to get to work.
Was it reversed when you...
No, the current government has not changed that fare structure, to their credit. So we did things that otherwise would have been very hard to do. And my hope always when we have a circumstance where somebody is either about to or does win with a thumping majority is that they actually use it to do some of the things that are otherwise very hard decisions. It's very hard to be brave when you're a marginal government. It's a lot easier when you have a majority. And the insight I think that newly elected leaders need to realize is that a government starts to die from the moment it is born. Governments never grow more popular. They always grow less popular. And so the time to do things and the time to explain to the electorate why you're doing difficult things is when you are sometimes ironically when you're the least prepared to do so, when you're first in government. But you made the point, and I have to agree with it. Rudd had that opportunity, and in many ways I think the circumstances we're in now are reflected by a range of factors, but one of them has to be the missed opportunity in that first 2 years of government, where expectations and things were promised, expectations were raised, and quite frankly, they weren't met. And things didn't change. And we got bogged down in inquiries and processes and ongoing discussions, and ultimately nothing was delivered. That's an opportunity that potentially sits before the current government, or potentially sits in front of the government elected after the September 14th.
To make the point about how governments decline, John Button once told me a story about an incoming Prime Minister who met the outgoing Prime Minister and was given 3 envelopes and was told that as you have a crisis, open them in order 1, 2, 3. So the first crisis comes, he opens the first envelope, and it is blame the opposition, blame the previous government. So he goes out and does that and goes on for some months, buys a bit of support. Second crisis comes, blame the media. He opens the envelope, blame the media, so blames the media. And the third crisis comes and he opens the third envelope and it says, prepare for opposition. And there's a fair bit of that, unfortunately, that does go on.
We could do with a few more buttons, couldn't we, on both sides? If you have a question, please put your hand up and somebody will put a microphone. I think you asked one last time. I think we'll go to someone else. Yeah, well, you did. You get one every time. That man behind you.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much for the interesting chat. My question to both the speakers is, what do you think of the idea of giving income tax powers back to the states and slimming down the federal government to the bare basics like defence, Medicare, Centrelink, foreign affairs, etc.?
I personally think it's a great idea. I do think federal government is not good at direct service delivery. And I don't mean that, I'm not making a comment about Labor or Liberal. I think federal government is far removed from direct service delivery, does not do it well, and would be better served if they pulled out of it. When they have tried to do it, they haven't delivered it very well. The other challenge that you have when direct service delivery and when the federal government starts to parse bits of it out is you get the levers that affect service delivery costs, the drivers, are not controlled by one level of government. So the health is a great example. So what the health reform tried to do was to ensure that the levers that are the drivers of people going to the public hospital system were better managed. I don't think it's necessarily achieved that, but the idea that your GPs are not available after hours, so you go to the emergency department, which is the most expensive form of care, the idea that there aren't enough aged care beds, so people spend longer time in expensive hospital beds rather than going to some other form of age-appropriate rehabilitative service. Because the federal government operates those two ends, primary care and aged care, and the state government operates hospital care, you just have a system set up that is bound to drive everybody to the most expensive form of care, hospitals. So I would prefer a system whereby we have a more integrated service delivery approach. I would prefer a system whereby states were able to raise revenue to be able to meet those costs. And I certainly think federal government is best spent using its time on macro issues like taxation and defence. I would say there are always going to be areas, and I think the National Disability Insurance Scheme and Medicare, potentially Medicare, although I think you could potentially give that back to the states too, but where you might have some economies of scale. But overall, I think the system we have and the crisis that we may get to one day, it will be driven by the fact that we just have created something completely unsustainable because of the way we provide the services.
I had a fellow this morning about 11 o'clock tell me that the Commonwealth should never be allowed to deliver anything. And it's a large part of what Kristina has just said, that the Commonwealth is not very good at service delivery. You saw it with pink bats, you saw it with school halls, although they needed to work with state governments to deliver that policy. What we need is a very hard-headed, independent assessment of who should be providing what services. Objectively done, not leave it to the political process to come up with that, and don't rely on COAG to do it. No. You need, as part of my review as to what services we want from government, you need to decide who does what. For example, if you decided that the state governments were responsible for schools, the delivery of schools, where the federal government was responsible for universities, which are more a national phenomenon than our schools, then you could divide those responsibilities fairly clearly. Right now we get duplication at both levels of two departments doing everything, and we have two departments of everything, and we don't have that distinction being made. But having said that, it comes back also to the other side: is how's it going to be paid for? And so do you have a national taxation system, a national GST, a national income tax, or do you allow the states to go off and raise their own revenue? It hasn't worked very well letting states raise revenue because they don't really have a growth tax. You have a little property sometimes when there's a boom on, and they do okay out of that. Payroll tax, I suppose, but payroll tax is an odd tax. You're taxing what you're trying to create, which are jobs. I mean, it's nonsensical. So that we've had this fragmentation of the tax base. So I'd like to see basically all that scrapped. So you may have to have a situation where all the funding is done at the federal level and most of the service delivery is done at the state level. And where there is a national requirement, say in education, where you want to set national standards, that's a national responsibility, federal government responsibility. But you get rid of the rest of the department, the Federal Department of Education, which is presently just monitoring everything that every state government does with its schools. And, you can really make very big savings in government by doing that sensibly. But, and look, the other way I'd look at it is there's a lot of duplication within each level of government. I was looking the other day at the federal level. You've got to go to something like 10 ministers or authorities to look at the issue of training.
Yeah.
You've got to go to about 6 or 7 to look at the issue of indigenous affairs.
Yeah.
Now, how nonsensical is that within government? You've got duplication, competition, conflicts of interest. And so I think there's a lot you can do to solve those problems, but that's got to be a very hard-headed, independent, objective assessment of the way the Federation ought to work.
G'day, thanks for the great speech. What I'm wanting to know is, with all of the short-term thinking that's going on here, bad decisions just because of these electoral cycles, to what extent do you think the rise of the political class, the professionals, the apparatchiks has caused this to happen? And will we see the likes of, say, John again, who's just happy to go out in a blaze of glory? Or is that are those days past us?
Look, I am worried about the political class, and you know, my wife constantly tells me that you're part of that little elite over there, and I'm not interested at all. I'm trying to, feed the kids and get them to school, and unfortunately, we have allowed that sort of political class to develop, and it's a very incestuous thing. We were talking before about being in Canberra and how isolated you really are, and everything's a crisis, everything's trauma, because somebody in the gallery asked you a question at 4 o'clock. And to the rest of the people out there in the real world, that's sort of irrelevant, and it doesn't really change the course of history very much at all. We do need to think about what we want, and obviously, ideally, the whole process has changed. I mean, another John Button example, we were doing a radio program together, and he was lamenting the fact that people go into politics today for different reasons. In the olden days, as he said, 50s, 60s, 70s perhaps, a significant percentage of people went into politics at the end of a career, where they were giving something back. They weren't there for status, they weren't there for the superannuation, they weren't there for the cash salary or whatever. That's changed dramatically as the age levels come down, lack of experience, lack of standing, and it becomes an end in itself to be a politician and to train as a politician and to so start as an apparatchik and go through the system. So I think we've lost the plot on a lot of that, and it's going to take leadership to get it back, in the sense that I think, if you were an incoming Prime Minister today, I think you'd have to seriously think about getting a small group of advisors, not sycophantic advisors, people who will fearlessly tell you what's good and bad for the country around you, and use that as a benchmark against which you foster public service debate. I think that's a practical way to make it work. It's a thing that Abbott could do, for example, rather than just rely on his ministers or just rely on the public service as it's there. But right now it's been a very politicised process within the bureaucracy. Ministerial offices are pretty political and focused on spin rather than substance. And so it's a very difficult situation to change. But I think leadership can change that.
One more really quick one.
I was just thinking about another policy issue. Do you understand why we're voting on a referendum in September? Because we haven't heard anything about it
This is
to this
a
point.
recognition of local government.
Recognition of local government. So it's 3 months away. I don't think anyone knows anything about it. And
well, I do. I'm the mayoress of the city of Botany Bay. So.
but
For those of you who don't know, my husband is the mayor of Botany Bay in Sydney, making me the mayoress.
But I mean, realistically, what chance a referendum? I mean, why are we spending this money? Because what chance is that a referendum gets up when we know nothing about it today? I'm just thinking about it, as a policy issue, and we know nothing about it. We've got this huge education campaign in 3 months. It seems a silly piece of policy.
Well, my understanding
that
we're doing this referendum largely to allow the federal government to continue to directly fund local government. Because currently you could make an argument that constitutionally the federal government does not have the right to directly fund local government. Now, I think there's a whole other debate about whether federal government should be directly funding local government, but certainly federal government has been and most likely will continue to do so. You think of things like the Black Spots program that the Howard government brought in, and I'm pretty sure that federal governments find a great deal of value in being able to
Look, I think it's a political football that's been kicked around for a long time. In the Fraser days, I guess it was principally a responsibility of the federal government to fund local government. Then the Howard GST package basically tried to shift the responsibility for funding local government to the states. Quite frankly, to the satisfaction of local governments, has never worked very well. And they have this naive view now that if they can get this recognition in the Constitution, it will give them a sustainable funding base. I made myself very unpopular last year at the National Convention of Local Governments, where I said that I thought that was absolute nonsense. That just because you had recognition in the Constitution guarantees you nothing. And you won't guarantee that they will be funded properly and effectively. And it raises the big issue, and this is the danger with a referendum like this. Most people in the electorate believe we're over-governed. We don't need 3 levels of government. If you're starting from scratch, you'd probably only have 2 levels of government, one national government and regional government.
State, absolutely.
Not broken up by states, a historic accident, but by regions that make some sort of economic and political sense.
You wouldn't want money at the moment on it, would you?
That debate comes all the time when you go to something like this. So the no case is interesting. Now, I think today they passed the legislation, or about to pass the legislation, to give the same amount of cash to the no vote as to the yes case. But referendum are very difficult to pass in this country because you need to win a majority of the electorate in a majority of the states. There is always enough states to say no. And they're very hard, to get. The no case is a very easy case to run in that side. If you don't understand it, don't vote for it. They can run a fear campaign in a heartbeat. So while this may be a sensible reform, there are a lot of other things in the Constitution I think are fairly more important, including the whole Commonwealth state funding structure that we've been talking about. But as you rightly say, it's sort of slipping in there, and you've got 3 months, you'll have a fairly, I think, probably heavy-going campaign. It'll probably get up. But because it has federal bipartisan support anyway, although within those parties, Barnaby Joyce doesn't like it, for example, in the National Party, there are divisions there that could easily be exploited. But I guess it might get up, but it won't do what people want it to do, which is fund local government. Most of us feel pretty dissatisfied about funding local government through our rates. So, I keep sinking in the potholes that are in my in the area where I live. You got to come to Botany Bay. It's funny, just one small story. I was in PNG. I do a lot of work in PNG these days, and there's a big thing there, potholes on all the roads. And you say, I could see some ears sticking up out of the pothole. And the issue is, were they rabbit's ears or giraffe's ears? And unfortunately, in my where I live, they're becoming giraffe holes rather than rabbit holes. And that's why local government is looked at, I think, very poorly, because they don't deliver the basic services that people imagine they should, filling potholes.
Thank you for that, John. You've left me with something to terrify me with roads for the rest of my life. That was a fascinating conversation. It went so quickly. And I'm very, very grateful that you had both turned up and so generously shared your wit and wisdom this evening. Please thank John Hewson and Kristina Keneally.